Hello, everyone. This is Aran. I am an educator of philosophy based in Austin, Texas. Today, I'm going to have a conversation with my great friend Tren. Hello, Tren.
Hi everyone, this is Chen, your friend. I'm a cultural historian of medieval Europe and China. Glad to be with you all today.
Today, we're going to continue our conversation on John Otling Smith's book, Niche Construction. We have so far talked about the standard evolutionary theory, what basic problems Otling Smith see in the standard evolutionary theory, and why he thinks it is necessary to go back to the basics of biological entities, meaning life, energy, and information, to understand what is exactly missing in the standard evolutionary theory. What is going to happen today is that we want to talk about niche construction, which is the name of the book. The reason niche construction is now coming to the foreground is that for Adling Usumi, life, or what makes life possible, is a combination of bioenergetics, bioinformatics, and systems of inheritance. And in this kind of a triad of conditions for life, one way that all of these elements going to come together is through genetic transmission, right? And that's basically what the standard evolutionary theory is all about. The standard evolutionary theory wants to tell us that ultimately what we have in terms of the bioinformatics of life is genetic transmission. And of course, that bioinformatics gets intertwined with bioenergetics, and of course, it's a transmission system in the form of inheritance. Now, the issue for Adling Gusmi is that true population genetics is pivotal and fundamental when it comes to um, contributing information to life. It is pivotal for giving the information needed for managing the energy flow to organisms. It is pivotal for creating patterns of energy consumption for acquiring enough information that ultimately reduce the dependency to energy. And all of these are happening not just in one single individual, but in the population, and is getting transmitted. But this story does not exhaust the information inheritance systems that contribute to the evolution of life. In other words, just because a lot of these layers mark a trace on genetics, that doesn't tell you how life evolves, period. To understand how life evolves, we need a more expansive understanding of information inheritance in nature. Only when we understand that information, diverse information inheritance systems, we can understand that even when we're looking at the gene level, what exactly we're looking at and why we are looking at that. This is not a refutation of the basic premise of a standard evolutionary theory, the modern synthesis. It is to supplement that with two other layers, individual learning and cultural transmission. But both of these layers, to be properly understood, require understanding another concept. And that concept is niche construction. Trent, do you have anything to say at this point?
No, I think I did a good job. We'll start with what SET, standard evolution theory, and niche construction theory both accept, namely population genetics and centrality. Olin Smith is also emphasizing the incompleteness of its adversary theory by introducing individual learning and the cultural transmission. And we are gonna unpack the relationship among these three terms in this and the coming episode. Yes.
Excellent. To get to the point about both population genetics and like the basic structure of the other forms of information inheritance, we need to remember that every knowledge gaining system in nature needs to satisfy a number of conditions. And this is a parallel to what we discussed when we were talking about Shannon and Shannon's information and what exactly it implies to have information and turn information into knowledge and turn knowledge into some sort of a adaptation. Um, the important thing about the kind of a very similar, structurally the same structure in nature is that the knowledge gaining system that we have needs to have a filter that basically creates like causal networks, right? We need to be able, in other words, to detect certain cause and effect relationships in nature to be even like in the position of dealing with it. And those like detections are not like intelligent in any form of um, intentional, conscious way. They could be very automatic and kind of embedded in behavior types of detections. But any information insofar as it is relevant to survival and reproduction of an organism must be able to make basic distinctions, at least, between different causal chains. So detect them and differentiating them. Very basic thing, very, 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 very kind of like broad version of this story is causal chains that will end in demise of the organism. Like being able to detect those is a basic knowledge act that an organism can should go through. Otherwise, again, the system is not going to survive, not for any magical reasons, just because it it unwillingly exposes itself to something that kills it. So there has to be a version of this kind of detection of cause and effect relationships. And it is not just enough to detect. The information needs to be registered, right? And registration means a form of memory system. And we're thinking, just like we're in our understanding of information, we are thinking about memory in a very, very basic sense, right? Memory could be, first of all, non-living, abiotic, right? And AI systems now perfectly show how this could work without any biological imperative. But even like Theseus or very much simpler um, robotic systems also show something similar. There has to be a memory though, because information, or rather information turned into knowledge, is not so much about that immediate moment of learning. It's about some form of application later on. And if there is in no way the information that has been learned and turned into some form of basic knowledge is not transformed into some or transcribed into a memory system, it cannot be retrieved. Um, the whatever uncertainty was reduced through the process of learning is lost if there is no memory. Again, this is a great opportunity to think about all the exciting ways that memory could exist in life, right? From like bacteria to civilizations. and like what really counts as this system of tracking, um, and system of like registering the causal relations that one finds in nature. And ultimately, the relevance, like the ultimate layer of the bioinformatics of life is to express that knowledge that was previously registered in memory systems through some sort of a communication channel. And this expression could be retrieval within the same individual, remembering in a very basic sense of the word, right? Or it could be expressed in the form of teaching others and expressing it as communicating it. The communication part could be in the form of like a communication happens within oneself, that one knows what the situation they're dealing with now is in reference to what they have dealt with and the causal patterns they have figured out. Or this could be, or this could be about communication with other entities or other members of the population, and for them to be able to express that at the proper time based on that transmission. Trent?
Yes, just two things. The first is to perhaps to kind of a refresher of our memories, like using that Theseus like, experiment to put some more concreteness to these 3 points. So when the like electronic mouse in that maze, through trial and error, detect which specific juncture turning left will lead to a wall and or lead to the cheese eventually. That's the doing the first step of detecting the cause and the effective relationship. And the mouse, the Theseus needs to have a memory storage like system to be able to set all relays to the right path, which is the second point you illustrated here. And the third one is that once the whole relay is set properly, then this specific mouse could like run through the whole maze in one go and um, forget about whether who is remembering the whole thing, but another mouse could enjoy the benefit of this knowledge system, as if there is some horizontal information knowledge transmission between these two individuals. I think that example perhaps helps us to better grasp what you just summarized it here. Second thing, I'm very curious what you have to say is like the cause and effect, and which is the important topic for Western philosophy for centuries. And here's really interesting that it also shows up that, in fact, I'm thinking of a Kant that's like the ability to infer such a causal relationship is intrinsic, perhaps to reason or other stuff. But here he's saying that it means that it's not just to that, it's to like to life itself, or without the ability to detect, register, and apply such like causality, there won't be life to begin with. So I find that the parallel very striking and interesting. I'm curious whether you have anything to say onto that.
Yes, I think that that was something that I was immediately reminded of when I read this, and I think that's fascinating because you're absolutely correct. Like in the second analogy of the first critique, Kant, basically the argument is that unless you have a system of distinguishing cause and effects, you cannot really understand certain things about temporal order of things. So, like, cause and effect is a requirement to temporally order the world. But I find it very interesting in terms of like when we are thinking, because Kant is like very much interested in this kind of like conditions of possibility thesis. The whole philosophical project is very much on that. How that could be like intertwined with this whole like topic about like how is life possible, and how like things that Kant might think in a more at least explicit way are about application of concepts, maybe about something much more basic, that this kind of detection of cause and effect could happen and should happen much earlier than any application of concept, even pure concept, is happening. But I hear you and I recognize the parallel, and I think there is something fascinating about that. Excellent. So with this tri-layered structure, we can just kind of go and see where Oddling SME and SED actually very much are um, in agreement, which is population genetics. Remember, we're talking about population genetics, we're talking about evolution, and we're talking about evolution in the context of living beings evolution. So the idea is that living beings cannot survive unless they inherit information, and they inherit information through population genetics, at least one major one. For SCT, the only important one. And this could be a few generations, it could be millions of years, but the idea of a genetic, like what is a gene, not just as a material content, but like what does a gene does? Basically, a gene gives the possibility of the growth of a phenotype or a trait in general that functions in a way as a filter of the world, a filter that ultimately has an adaptive advantage. Now, if you have genes that contribute to development of your eyes, that is there for that cause and effect detection um, structure. Like if you can see, you can have a lot of advantage of where things are and how things are functioning. Okay. If there is a gene component to the memory structure of your brain, that is part of the same story. That gene is there because it had a competitive advantage over an animal that had a far worse memory. You We have a better memory, and that is helping us, right? Um, and of course, all of this is just in the constraint of energy and like body volume and all of these kind of like other metrics that you cannot have like infinite memory and infinite, you know, calculus in your head for like restrictions of energy and resources or like the specific kind of obstacles that have been in front of your or our ancestors. But the idea is that like, all of these genes are ultimately about what the pattern that we have described: detect, register, and express. And in social animals like us, this could also be about like social like relations, like detecting cheaters is about like creating a causal link, right? You create a causal link and you create an inductive gamble, basically, which is that here is what this story is. This person cheated me in this way in this scenario. That's the causal narrative that I can create. And there's an inductive gamble that trusting cheaters won't pay off. So these are all these kind of like, and with all of this, of course, remember all of this. And next time this person shows up, don't let them enter the club. Don't let them enter your house. Don't lend them money. Don't do anything else, right? This is nothing but like we see the things at the expressed traits and behaviors, but all we it is happening is this kind of unfolding of uh, like underlying genes, and those genes are not necessarily like one line inference systems, but they could afford phenotypic, sorry, plasticity, meaning that they could give us a norm of behavior. A gene could really kind of give us a margin of action instead of like a final output of an action. But ultimately, that is nothing but kind of creating a causal narrative that hopefully the causal narrative will help that individual organism to survive. For standard evolutionary theorists, this is it. Now, what these genes really express, what traits come out, whether this animal has an eye, or it has an immune system, or it has one cell and like 10 cells or a million cells, that doesn't matter. What matters is that these genes are there to create different causal stories insofar as individual survival, individual survival and reproduction is concerned. And this applies to all living beings, independent of how intentional they are or independent from how conscious they are from causes and effects, right? So, like for um, like the SET or anyone who is like advocating for this kind of genetic reductionism, and also for Odling Smee and people in niche construction theory, the point here is very similar to Shannon's information. We shouldn't think about this detect, register, express as anything radically conceptual, right? If a bacteria like changes course when it sees another bacteria that might eat it, like and just destroy it, like destroy its membrane, because it has like developed certain like detectors that could like register the shape of this bacteria. And if it has a certain shape, it has learned genetically that that could be dangerous or that could create problems for like the continuation of the life of that bacteria. That's the story. That's a story of causal detection of cause and effect. It doesn't need to have a nervous system to detect that. So when we're thinking about this detection, we need to like remember how Theseus learned. And most organisms learn much more like Theseus than they learn like human beings. Even there will be people who would say that human beings are also just learning like Theseus. It's just we just can like express that. The main process doesn't change at all. But the important thing here is that like for standard evolutionary theorists, this is the end of the story. No other information inheritance system is important for understanding how evolution works. Evolution works based on genetic natural selection. And genetic natural selection is about information. Basically, the genes that ultimately transfer the adaptive information to the organisms based on their current environment, they survive. And the rest don't. End of the story. Trent.
Yes, I like what you summarized here, and this is what we're dealing with is the place agreed upon between both SET and initial construction theory. I have a question, clarifying question for you is here population genetics, we are really the basic unit of analysis here is really population. We're not dealing with individual organism. They of course they have their own role to play in like detecting on like a causal patterns and applying, or like they are the specific concrete places where such collective genetic pool manifested interacted with the environment. But if we were to answer that question, where's the agency located here? How do you think like SET people would say? It would say, oh, real agency here is really in the whole population genetic pool and like the regulating forces that are about it, and the individual organisms are kind of once removed at least from that, if it is not completely devoid of agency.
Yes, I mean that's a good question. And I don't know enough about population genetics at all to really give a sophisticated answer to that. I just think that like when we're thinking about genetics insofar as it matters at the evolutionary scale,
Mhm.
whether like one, it's about like whether a variation like reaches a certain level of existence within a population and gets a chance to be passed on. Because it could be a lot of like random variations that pop up in like individuals as mutations or as errors, copying errors uh, for many reasons. Um, those are not really the relevant things here, although they could become relevant. Just some random hypothetical would be like, let's say like there is like a subcategory of human beings start having like a bad copy of some gene that actually that bad copy solves an adaptive problem in like dealing with a certain type of like pathogen or like some form of like a heart disease, right? Now, let's say like there is a pandemic and there is like a virus that attacks like the data specific, that's the pathogen, right? Like that's the attack, and a lot of people are just dying based on heart attack. Now the people who just had this bad gene, quote unquote, now is the ones that are going to survive. But the idea is that like now what matters is that if they reproduce, that gene that previously known as bad gene, now it is something that is competitively advantageous and it's just going to reveal itself in the population, right? I think that's my basic understanding of the relationship between the two. Variations could happen in individuals, but unless they are happening at a like certain kind of a critical mass, they're not be able to kind of be involved in that kind of reproduction process and therefore kind of lose their evolutionary relevance unless they reach that critical mass and they show some adaptive advantage and get reproduced. They're not relevant to our conversation, and that's why we talk about population genetics, not just you know genetics of a random individual. That's my understanding.
Yeah, it
Go
makes
ahead.
a lot of sense to me. Also, that's how I think about the whole situation that when we're dealing with it in the future, other types of non-strictly genetically based inheritance systems that we see perhaps individual organisms are contributing to evolution in more direct the way than like SET affords. So that's just I didn't get the chance to think about the big picture, how the big questions we are asking, like agency in history, connected to the specifics. But like what you just said, that helps to provide clarity, which definitely bear that question in mind while we're learning and discussing further.
And I think it is important, I think, in the sense of like kind of creating a parallel as we are moving towards that. Like that this is population genetics, this is the way individual organisms matter or don't matter in this type of inheritance system. But when we get to the individual learning part of this story that Aldous Smith wants to say, this relationship between individual and populations could be very different than the genetic level. So this is not something that is necessarily repeatable. Um, Excellent. So the whole thing about Aldous me is that he thinks this is insufficient. This is not enough. We need more. We need more because um, population genetics is not exhausting what there is insofar as uh, information systems or inheritance systems of information that are important for evolution of life. And to understand what these other two layers are, we need to understand niche construction. Finally, the book is called Niche Construction. We have been telling you niche construction is coming. It has come. What is niche construction? Well, niche construction is basically the process of an organism changing their environment, right? That an organism is in an environment, they make a change to that environment. This is as simple as that. But it gets kind of interesting and complicated and like layered when we can really look at that. Because one, like the way that usually niche construction is understood is like beavers making building dams, right? That's a very, very, very kind of like clear version of this story because where beavers live, like dams do not naturally emerge. Like it's not like the dams like just flow like water and they're just kind of they're there. No, there has to be work done, energy spent, remember, to build the dams. And that's what the beavers do. Now, when they do that, they're altering the environment for themselves. And when they're altering the environment themselves, they are controlling a variable in that story. And they're not just changing the environment for themselves, but they're changing the environment for other species as well. When you build a dam, you change the flow of like water. If you change the flow of the water, you impact the stream. If you impact the stream, the prey predator relationship amongst fish will change. Might have impact on some aspects of like pressure. Like all of those things could change, and a lot of like microbiomes and like other entities there could be impacted. Okay, now we're going to talk about that impact in a moment. But one thing that I really wanted to emphasize, and this is something that in our critical remarks also is going to show up, is that don't think about niche construction only as dam creation or like nest building, right? I have two like examples of what Oddling Smee mentions as like niche construction that I find like just I find both of them very interesting for very different reasons. One is just moving, which is very odd, but if you think about it, one way that you can alter your environment is to just change the environment, which is like a kind of a very indirect way. It's just kind of an odd way to think about this because the term seems to suggest like you need to, get to work and like build something. But if a bird migrates from like one environment to another, the environment has been altered, right? So when we say altering the environment, don't think about the altering of the environment as the environment is fixed. I'm just going to go do an engineering project in it. Um, Changing the environment means altering environment, although the original environment remains the same with a caveat, which I will return to, but you altered your environment by changing your environment. But also, you have altered your original environment by leaving it. Because a bird leaving an ecosystem has an impact. And like the minimal of that is like the bird's poop. And that is something in that environment that not only adds to the heat or adds to like some form of food for certain insects or some kind of like distribution of chemicals in the soil, it has an impact, right? So moving is as impactful as, building a dam in an environment, or it has an impact, even if it's not the same exact type of impact. The second thing is to not think about niche construction at the level of like multicellular animals, right? Don't think mammals. Don't think birds. Those are very like clear examples. Those are very kind of like obvious examples of building a dam, building a nest, so on and so forth. One amazing like example that Alding Smee mentions in the book that I really want to know more is photosynthesis. There was a point in the history of life that living beings could not manipulate the energy of the sun. And there was a moment that we, broadly speaking, unlocked that. That suddenly sun was there as a source of energy that could be used. How did that happen? That's a different story. But the idea is to get to the very, 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 very basic point about niche construction, manipulating the energy flow, right? If the, like, why do beavers build dams? Manipulating the energy flow so that it benefits them energy wise and information wise, and both of them for them to survive and reproduce, right? Why do birds migrate? Because if they live in the same environment, they're going to lose a lot more body heat and they're going to be susceptible to predators, and it's going to be much harder to find food. They need to spend a lot more energy to find food in like a very, very cold environment covered by snow. So they move, they spend that energy to gain more energy, to have access to more energy. They're manipulating the energy flow. And they're manipulating the energy flow using information. And at least part of that information is inherited. Inherited in some ways genetically. Now, photosynthesis is nothing different fundamentally. What is photosynthesis? Photosynthesis is a way to manipulate the resources around you so that you can spend less energy to survive. You need less to survive. You have more like free roaming capacity. You have more margin of error of losing energy in other ways because now you have access to a new source of energy. So when we think about niche construction, I think it is important to like have these images, these diverse images, so that we're not like hyper like focused in like very kind of clear engineering like tasks that some animals are capable of doing. Trent.
Yes, I just want to further develop your example of photosynthesis. I was also blown away when I was reading it. I think the point here is not just that, like, at a certain moment, life started to be able to capture, say, carbon dioxide and utilize the solar energy as a very stable source of energy to get carbon for itself and produce energy. But also the detritus of that whole process, namely oxygen fundamentally change other species' living environment. So now that we're thinking about like life on Earth, often what makes Earth like suitable for life to flourish? Usually, the first thing come to mind is like we have oxygen, but that thing itself is a product of life activities of other life organisms. So for instance, it's a kind of really powerful example telling us how certain so-called givenness of the environment in which like individual lives that are surviving or thriving actually comes as a result of life's individualized own activities, like the title of the book suggested, is how life basically directs its own direction for evolution because we now have lungs, everything, all with as kind of consequence of that quote unquote these constructing activities of some bacteria like eons back.
Exactly. And I think now just we have the seed for what is going to become important later on for Otling Smee, which is how exactly this is relevant for understanding the evolution of life. And these types of causal chains that we are talking about are very much important in that kind of a final position. But before we getting there, let's just kind of like unpack a number of other things and kind of see in what sense niche construction is relevant to evolution of life, right? Like in what way kind of intervenes in that process. And once we have that image later on, we can kind of see in what sense there is a non-genetic level to this whole story that without which you can still go ahead and just like follow the genetic patterns in nature, but you cannot really understand what is going on without understanding this structure. Okay, so there are basically like three layers, and this is kind of the core of what Adling Smee calls the niche construction theory, right? And niche construction theory, remember, it's like an add-on. It is an extension of the modern synthesis and the standard evolutionary theory. Right? Um, the beginning point of this is actually in genetics, right? And I think the some of these points are like very directly and immediately discussed by Adling Smee, but some others are less explicit. Um, One major thing is that let's go back to population genetics and let's like think about how population genetics works. Well, population genetics tells us that we need to think about natural selection at the genetic level, and we need to think about natural selection as a form of adaptation. In other words, the genes, not just organisms, but genes, like quote unquote selfish genes, um, that manage to survive are the ones that will survive. It's not anything like no extra like layer is needed. Some genes manage to survive, right? They manage to survive because they have an adaptive advantage over other genes. Um, and remember that the gene story is in some ways about like detection of cause and effect, for instance, right? When you have genes that develop your nose or like some sort of nostrils that could like detect smell, then that is basically giving you a cause and effect system that like this smells this because it is rotten and I shouldn't eat it. That's what that ultimately is. And that genes keep surviving because that is a very important distinction. That's a very important detection, right? And when there is a memory system that remembers that smell this, get out, that means that there is something that is gonna help that specific gene survive alongside with the genes that will contribute to the memory structure of that animal or organism. Now, the thing that is important and it has been present in our conversations with like evolutionary psychology and critics of evolutionary psychology is that how these kind of cause and effect structures, or in some ways like inference machines, really function. Because there is one major problem that this like whole story will have, which is sure, like some things about like basic detection of some uh, rotten food versus like edible food is definitely something that is valuable and it's hard to get rid of. But like think about genes that like really contributed to how we make choices for our mates, right? For mating choices. There are genes that are active in that space too. Now, if you have, imagine like you have a very, very rigid gene for mating that like says I don't know. If you see like pale skin that's good enough. Go ahead, right? Go try to have that uh, mating, like choose that. Well, that is a very like crappy system. Like it really filters almost nothing relevant there because a lot of pale like females or males are going to be non-advantageous reproduction wise, and that system is not really letting you detect. Well, you need much more sophisticated systems of detection then, right? Like if you see like this type of body, then you're good to go. Well, there could be all sorts of other problems. Maybe there is an entity, there is like another human being that body wise really matches that kind of a healthy body for reproduction, but is suffering from like severe schizophrenia, right? And if you cannot have any like way to detect that, the behavioral detection, then you're not gonna have a great time raising the next generation with that person, probably. So you see that these are all these elements. Now, the thing is, especially in like for social animals, these kind of complexities pile up, not just because things within societies change, but also there are all sorts of other like conditionals that might exist in the society that will influence the question of whether this is the right mate or not. This is the right reproductive choice for me or not. Now, if it seems like that you have two options from this perspective of like on the side of the genes, either create like really huge number of inferences, which is one way to interpret what is actually happening, which we're getting into in our critical remarks, or the competitive advantage of agency getting recognized through generations, right? And when we say agency here, we mean like the ability of the organism not to be tied to rigid inference systems that are just inherited. Okay. This is like what it means to talk about like self-control over inductive gambles, right? That we can kind of stand above and kind of see and reassess whether what we have inherited and learned really matches what we need this moment. Okay. So like moving away from like a very like a Theseus-like machine that's a kind of like switches with binaries to something that could kind of stand above and assess at a more meta level. And this has its own evolutionary history. Okay. One thing that niche construction theory wants to say is that there is competitive advantage of agency. Okay. So there are genetic grounds for more agency in certain, especially multicellular organisms that will help them survive, given their complicated social conditions. But once you kind of unfold that, that agency gets intertwined with the possibility of transforming the environment. Because if you have, if you have certain kind of needs that will tell you like, here's like the mate that I need to have, right? And if something changes in that you lose your chance for mating given the conditions, right? And you don't have any kind of a pre-existing plan to how to solve that problem. If you have agency over your environment, there might be ways that you can get out of that situation. You can move, right? And get to a new environment. That's one thing. You can start like building a structure within that system that gives you a competitive advantage that is that wasn't there before, right? It could be like even, I'm using a complicated human example that maybe I shouldn't use, but like if you can like change something about the environment that make those mating chances change, then that's a positive, right? The point here is that agency gets intertwined with impacting the environment around you beyond just responding to it as like a norm of reaction that is just genetically expressed, right? A more complex version of that story, at least, is needed. And once the transformation of the environment kicks in, you have unlocked something very important because that could be the route to adaptation. Okay. Now, going back to something that is much simpler than like human social life, worms. Worms have genes, and worms need to adjust their temperature of their bodies, or some worms need to, right? Now, you have a problem as a worm then. You need to make sure that the temperature of the environment doesn't destroy you. Okay. Now, let's say like you've had like a mechanism there, and something changes in your environment. Now, that a specific subpopulation of worms is at a disadvantage. It doesn't have the genetic component that is about heat adjustment, um, to a degree that the environment is hitting it. Okay. Now, there are a couple of things that this could go to the next stage. The ones that don't have that won't survive. The ones that have that genetic component will survive. Random mutations, those will survive. Those will reproduce. We'll have a new genetic like system in the next generation. But the whole thing that niche construction theory wants to say is that that's not the only way. If the worms dig in and go to the soil and find a very sustainable, temperature wise, quote unquote, nest there that they can easily return to after eating outside, then they don't need that gene for adjusting temperature. They have solved that selective pressure by niche construction. Now, the next generation of that subpopulation of worms will be relaxed on the gene that is for temperature adjustment. And in fact, that might start to like get woven out. Interestingly enough, though, the genetic component for the ability to dig now has a higher advantage, right? Or higher chances of survival because now the pattern has changed. The whole point being the niche construction activity of a population of worms could change the selective pressures they face and their future generations face. And with that, the genetic structure that their descendants will have, for millions of years even. And the point is, and I think this is a point that could possibly be contested, that the fact that those worms went inside the soil was not itself some sort of a inference code that they just like followed, right? Animals will make such decisions when they have minimal agency that are not just following an already existing natural command in their genes. Because remember, having a certain level of agency, which is not following rigid natural commands that come with your genes, is the part of this whole story, right? So you have minimal agency. Minimal agency means that you can like kind of like get out of these gene imperatives in a very rigid way. when you get out of that, you can transform the environment in important ways. And when you transform the environment, you can transform the selective pressures that your species and other species face, and in fact, impact and co direct where the evolutionary path of your descendants gonna be. Trent.
Yes, thank you very much for that. It's a lot of really, really mind-boggling piece of information there. There are 2 points that immediately come to my mind while listening to it. First is to go back a question I asked you a couple of minutes ago on the agency between individual and collective. It seems to me, even though we're dealing with the population genetics here, so something that the NCT and SET both agree on, but it's given our very elementary understanding for the population genetics, it seems here individual organisms that are given more perhaps the agency or definitely different groups of such the individuals are given more agency vis-a-vis the whole species as a whole because for instance the earthworm example you gave we could hypothetically imagine in certain cases that such a group that chose to prioritize the genetic composition of digging and moving locations over like temperature control versus the other, which kind of put that species individual dialect in a different light compared to the traditional SET model. In the sense, it's not just passive individuals are just carrying out the command, the dictate of the genetic pool of the whole species. Instead, it's really a negotiation between the two. Sometimes it's individual activities that also shape the direction how genetic selection would operate. Another point is to go back to the first point you discussed on this slide is the competitive advantage of agency. One thing, perhaps a different way to put what you put there is like comes together with agency is that flexibility in the sense that a lot of decisions, at least according to Odlin Smith, do not need to be pre-coded in the genetic system. And the shorter you have, the less the energy consumed in transmitting and producing that genetic code. And so it's advantageous in two ways, not only in the way you just introduced about um, using a mechanism that is more superior to inducive gambles, but also it kind of liberates individuals or organisms from like loading everything into its genetically based inheritance system by leaving more space for that improvisation or self-adjustment and other types of inheritance beyond genetics.
Yes, I think it's very interesting because, yeah, you're right in the sense that I think as we open this can of worms, literally, of like the kind of like this, like if there's openness of agency within a population, then it seems like those like a subcategory of those um, individuals within that species could like invent a path that suddenly transforms everything about the whole society of like or the whole population in the way that like population genetics doesn't seem to work that way. Like it doesn't work in the way that like if you're only looking at the gene level of this transformation, what we see is not like any sort of like individual agency of any individual gene. That doesn't make any sense. It's just like these kind of like patterns like flow to a degree that like this is now the dominant and then just gonna get reduced and then gets increased and I think what makes this kind of a dialectical relationship that you were talking about interesting because yeah I mean what is interesting is exactly this kind of a dialectical relationship because I think as much as the individual agency of you know a worm finding a way down to the soil and others following it um, matters, that worm was also constrained by its genetic structure to be able to dig, right? So that, and it inherited that because of population genetics, right? So what it needed, what tools it had needed to be able to kind of invent or construct or disrupt was also constrained by genetics. But now, by that constraint, it now constrains the genetic pool, and that the next gene pool would add constraint to the individual agency and so on and so forth. So I think like one thing that both of us are, I think, are very interested in is that as we kind of get into these kind of types of relationships, like what model can accommodate this? What model could really like create these causal pathways and make sense of them in these kind of reciprocal ways that like this constraint opens a door and that door is another constraint and that new constraint is a new door and so on and so forth, and like the all this kind of dead ends that will come out of this and all the kind of um like quote unquote like the freedom that comes out of it. All of them are, I think, fundamentally interesting topics. But I think your intuition about the change in the individual universal relationship in this story is something that is very much relevant. Now, all of this is kind of the beginning point of discussing where we kind of began some of these like points with. And we started by saying that like what Otling Smee is talking about is that individual learning and cultural transmission are information inheritance systems that are relevant to the evolution of life. And the problem with um, the standard evolution theory is that it does not acknowledge this. So now that we have gotten to know at least the basics of the niche construction theory, we can formulate our question. How do individual learning and cultural transmission supplement genetics according to niche construction theory? In what sense individual learning and cultural transmission as activities intertwined with niche construction will contribute to the evolution of life that is not immediately about the genetic transmission or filtering of populations, but about something quite different. Something that will ultimately have an impact on the genetic distribution of a population, but is not reducible to the genetic distribution of a population. Trent?
No, nothing to add. Just remind the listeners, please stay attuned. In our next episode, we're going to discuss the role of the individual learning and the cultural transmission in evolution. Thanks for listening.